All right, welcome folks. Good afternoon. As people are filing in here, we've got a great group, over 30 of you just piling in one after the other. This is great. As you're coming in, I'm just gonna quickly start by orienting you to the Zoom functionality so you can best navigate the tools on this webinar. After that, I'll go into a brief overview of the webinar series and then to the flow of this workshop. So I'm sure you all are very familiar with Zoom by now, but we just want to let you know my colleague Megan Fowler and I are your tech supports today. So please feel free to send us a private chat if you're having any technical issues or you need any further direct support throughout the call. We are keeping folks on mute today for the presentation. We do encourage you to have your video on if you're comfortable with that, just for networking purposes, but no pressure to do so. The participants button there will allow you to see the other folks who are with us on the call today. If you could go ahead and open that, the chat button, that's the one that looks like a little thought bubble. We as the moderators will maybe be sharing links and other information with you in the chat box today. You can also use the chat box to pose any questions or comments that you have, but we are asking that you please do try to hold your questions until we get to the Q&A section toward the end of the agenda today. And we're going to do our best to get to all your questions if we can. Notice too, there's a drop down that allows you to chat to everybody or privately to an individual. Today's presentation is being recorded and we'll be making it available on American Farmland Trust's website, along with a resource handout with resources related to today's topic. We're also going to be running a few polls today to learn a little bit more about those of you who are here with us today on the call. We're actually going to run the first one now. If you could all just take a minute to fill out, we just want to get a sense of who is here in the room with us. I'll just let you all take a second to fill that out. Okay, so this is pretty interesting. This is great. This is our intended audience. We've got a number of municipal volunteer and staff, land trust volunteers and staff, a number of nonprofit service providers, which is really exciting, a few regional planners and state agency folk, and a bunch of other categories. So if you all feel up to it, please feel free to go ahead in the chat. Just share with us what your other category is. We're curious to know where you're coming from today. Great, well, welcome all of you. And let's see, I'm just gonna officially welcome you all to the 5th and final webinar of the Farms for the Future project. You are right now in strategies and tools for supporting Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color in your community. And my name is Jamie Potter. I'm the New England Program Manager at American Farmland Trust. I'll soon be handing today's programming off to Stephanie Morningstar, but I wanted to just quickly take a moment to give you an overview of this webinar series for those of you who haven't been with us up until now. This series was created through the partnership and truly incredible organizing efforts of the following people. My colleague Megan Fowler and myself at AFT, Steph Morningstar at the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, Meg Quinn from Maine Farmland Trust, Jeremy Luigi at the Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire, and Nancy Everhart at the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. You can wave, Nancy. And this project has been generously funded by Jane's Trust. And today's program, as I mentioned, will be led by Steph Morningstar. She's the Executive Director at NEFOC Land Trust. And we also have some really wonderful video contributions from Omar Hassan, Christine Hutchinson, and from Leah Penneman. So we're really excited to share their stories with you today. And as I mentioned, this webinar is the 5th in a 5-part series of educational workshops that we have been working tirelessly and designed specifically for you folks who are at land trusts, municipalities, and other nonprofits and service providers in Vermont and the other 2 northern New England states. So especially due to COVID-19, as you all know, there's just this real growing interest in local agriculture, a real desire for more skills and training for securing a more resilient food system at the local level, as well as very timely conversation about advancing greater land justice. So we've designed each of these, as those of you who have been on these workshops before, each of them has been designed to offer core content, state-specific tools and resources, Q&A, networking opportunities. And each of these actually built off of the previous one. So if this is your first webinar with us, or if you missed a couple of them, we really do encourage you to go back and try to watch the webinar recordings. And as I said, they're all up on AFT's website already, and today's workshop will be loaded up on there as well. So check them out. Just a great suite of workshops that we've provided, ranging from generally how to make your community more farm friendly to specific strategies and tools for protecting farmland, making land available to farmers. And now this particular workshop that's really specific to supporting Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color in your community. So just quickly the agenda before I hand it off to Steph. Steph will be leading us through the history of land dispossession and racism around land here in New England, followed by some powerful case studies from those speakers whom I mentioned, and then some specific strategies and tools and things that you can think about in your own community or in your organization to support Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color where you live, where you work. And we will have time at the end for questions and answers, so please jot them down. And then we're going to try to wrap up by 3:30. So it's going to be a really full, jam-packed 90 minutes, but we're just so excited to have you all here today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this off to Steph Morningstar. She'll be leading you through the rest of today's presentation. So take it away, Steph. Thanks again so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamie. Thanks for joining us today, everybody. It's good to see some familiar names and faces amongst the participants, and obviously some new ones. I'm glad that I have this opportunity today to share a bit about the work of NEFOC and offer some suggestions for you to begin working or continue working with farmers of color in your state. So thanks so much for being here. I am Stephanie Morningstar. I'm a member of the Oneida Nation, and I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. I want to thank the New England Program Manager of AFT, Jamie Pottern. You're an amazing, extraordinary organizer. We really appreciate you pulling this together and inviting us, as well as the tech whiz behind all of this, and the person who's making this all happen technically with our slides and our Zooms and all the recording and all the stuff behind the scenes, Megan Fowler. I'd also like to thank our sponsor and our fiscal sponsor and our incubator, Soulfire Farm, and their board of directors for their guidance and support, as well as our own board of directors at NEFOC Land Trust, as well as the NEFOC network, our informal network of farmers of color, for continued movement and movement building and camaraderie. Lastly, I'd like to thank Jesse Smith Noyes Fund, Cooperative Development Institute, and the Nova Foundation for their essential support. So, go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Before we begin, let's take a moment, as a dear friend of mine says, to find the headwaters of our breath. And let's take a moment to recognize and ground in why we're all here, our relationship to the land and one another. This map, created by the Native Land Project, is a representation of Turtle Island's multitude of Indigenous territories, languages, and peoples, freed from the colonial boundaries that have carved into the Indigenous landscape. The lands I make a life on are known as the lands of our relatives, the Maple Nation, on Treaty 3 in Dish with One Spoon Wampum territory. This is the fun part, and I know that there's a lot of, when we're doing a webinar of this kind, everybody's muted, there isn't a lot of, in participation, and in this time of COVID, it's really hard to ground to place because we're all doing everything virtually. So this is a sort of another way that we can do that together. And there's lots of ways to do land acknowledgements. The way that we here at NEFOC do them is in the least extractive way possible. It's not about production, it's more about acknowledgement and recognition and connection to place. NEFOC Land Trust exists in the spirit of active and inclusive reconciliation. We occupy and serve the territory of the northeast part of what is currently called the United States, a colonial framework constructed upon the living land that is Turtle Island. I am honored and grateful to stand in the territory of my homelands, Dish with One Spoon Treaty. We recognize that acknowledging the traditional territories of the original stewards of these lands is opening a door to actionable reconciliation, repair, and relationship building. We are working to advance land access for Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color with an understanding that the territories we occupy hold the history and trauma of colonization, eugenics, forced removal, and land theft. We embody and honor this understanding by carefully considering how we engage the lands we may come to hold in trust through the establishment of continuous consultation and partnerships with Indigenous communities. By advancing strategies such as cultural respect easements, voluntary taxation, and other tools for acknowledging and repairing the complex history of colonization, and by listening and moving at the speed of trust while we do so. I invite you now to type into the chat which traditional territories you are currently living on and making a life on or come from. I'm honored to be sharing the resources and tools to advance land and food sovereignty today with respect to the territories of the Abenaki, Mohawk, Mohican, and Pennacock peoples, as well as the Wabanaki Confederacy. And I'd love to see where folks are coming from. Wabanaki, Elnu Abenaki, Nipmuc, Petumkapikamtuk, lots of Abenaki and Wabanaki. Wonderful, thank you so much. Wampanoag in Massachusetts, right on. Haudenosaunee Confederacy, ooh, ooh. All right, Mi'kma'ki, Agbanaki. Wonderful to see all these. Okay, I can go to the next slide. So we're doing this work sitting in between a long line of ancestors who came before us and paved the way for our faces yet to come, or what we call our future generations. This work is in every sense of the meaning ancestor work. I invite you to think about an ancestor you'd like to be present with us today, someone who might pop into your mind or heart right now who needs to hear some of this, or who might benefit from hearing this, or is holding a space for you in this work, or somebody who is inspiring you. So feel free, if you feel comfortable, to type their name into the chat box now and let our ancestors be here with us now. I'm going to call in today, Levi Schuler, my great-great-great-grandfather, who was a Black farmer. And let's see, who do we have here with us today? Ida Bell, Estelle. Thank you so much. All right. Ozelia, Grandma Barb. So grateful to have our ancestors with us in this work. George Helmer, Grandjan, Grandmother Hand, interesting, beautiful. Thank you, Nyawagoa. Daneto, that means may it be so. Okay, so let's go to our next slide. So James Baldwin, a very wise man, once said, "I am what time, circumstance, history have made of me certainly, but I am also much more than that. So are we all. Before we can explore how we can be more together, we need to set a bit of context and rationale behind where we came from. We can't delve into the entire history, obviously, of how we got to this place, but let's explore some of the moments that inform the work of Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust and the larger movement of land and food sovereignty. But before we do that, we're going to do a little poll. So let's just do a quick poll to gauge where we might need to focus today. So have you done any interpersonal anti-oppression training, any organizational anti-oppression training, advanced reparations policies in your organizations, or is this your first step? You can choose any and all of the above. So it'll give us an idea of like where to focus some of the webinar today. So lots of folks have done some internal anti-oppression training, fantastic. Similarly, organizational anti-oppression training. And it looks like about 20% have started building in advanced reparations policies in the organization, and about 13% are on their first step. So welcome, congratulations on that first step. We're glad to be on this journey with you. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Did you know that between 1776 and 1887, the United States seized over 1.5 billion acres from America's indigenous people by treaty and executive order, either by force or coercion? This map, created by the eHistory Project based on data produced by the Bureau of American Ethnology, mapped every treaty and executive order during that period, illustrating the invasion of America. You can see this by watching the blue territories disappear from east to west, being replaced by a tiny fraction of reservation lands where indigenous peoples have been forcibly relocated. Those reservations are those tiny little red squares that you see on the map. As you can see, the gray areas to the far east, where the original 13 colonies are, those were occupied prior to 1776, including Vermont. The Northeast US is encompassed in these territories, and because those were the original 13 colonies, there are very few cessations or treaties in those lands, basically meaning that this is truly stolen land. And this is really where we start. So you can go to the next slide, there we go. Let's start with a brief timeline of how the land and labor of Black and brown folks have been stolen through physical and bureaucratic violence. We don't have enough time today to break this down in any really huge detail, obviously, with an hour and a half. This is probably, you know, several webinars or a whole course, but we want to make sure that you get an understanding of not only the history, but also the adaptiveness of racism. So we call this adaptive racism for a reason. It's kind of like a virus, right? So you get a virus and you build up antibodies to that virus so that the virus can no longer replicate in you. Well, viruses do replicate, and they actually morph and they change to suit their environments. And that's very much what racism and systemic racism is. It's about morphing and changing based on the experience and the inputs of your environment. So if you can't do enslavement one way, then let's move to sharecropping. If you can't do sharecropping, let's control land and access to resources in other ways and extract labor in other ways. So that's what we talk about when you can see this clear sort of build up from enslavement to sharecropping to very specific acts to dispossess people of land and labor, and then also forcing folks into the systemic issues that have cropped up, like the ongoing police violence that we are seeing all around us today, the revocation of 40 acres and a mule, the terror campaigns that were additionally enacted to drive people of color off their lands, continued federal discrimination, redlining, everything after that blue line of the creation of the USDA is actually, in some ways, still ongoing. But I want to focus on one specific date, which is 1862. So we all know that enslavement was abolished in 1865, but slavery, and I know a lot of folks actually think that New England had nothing to do with enslavement, and unfortunately that's not the case. Slavery was actually a very dominant feature of the antebellum South, but it was also very pervasive in pre-Civil War North. New England states all have a history of slavery, and in the colonial period, Europeans invaded these lands and initially enslaved indigenous peoples who lived there. As the New England colonists drove out these indigenous peoples, they replaced these enslaved people with Africans and then invested heavily in the slave trade to power their economy. States such as New Hampshire, for example, never banned slavery. There, slavery only became illegal with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, whereas just next door, it was a very different story, and enslavement in Vermont actually was banished in 1777. So I want to just point out this sort of middle section, which is 1862, and that's sort of the culmination of everything that came before, and really set everything up for what came after. And that would be the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, and the development of the United States Department of Agriculture. The Homestead Act exploded Western migration by providing settlers 160 acres of indigenous land. It's been named unquestionably the most extensive, radical, redistributive governmental policy in US history. The national land dispossession policy not only benefited white folks, it continues to do so on exponential levels. It's estimated that about 93 million people, or a quarter of the US population, are inheritors of people who received Homestead Act allotments. Now, I'm aware that the Homestead Act is more of a Western expansion method of land dispossession, but the spirit behind the Homestead Act is really what we're pointing to today. And Vermont is one of those places that's very unique in that you have a lot of folks going to Vermont for something that we've started calling homesteading or back to the land, that back to the land movement. So just keeping that spirit of that terra nullius vibe going, that's really what that Homestead Act was about, and that spirit of homesteading. Also in 1862, President Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which distributed indigenous land, inaccurately named public domain lands, quote unquote, to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation, masquerading a massive transfer of wealth as a donation. The Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. In all, the Act redistributed nearly 11 million acres, an area larger than Massachusetts and Connecticut combined. And finally, in 1862, we see the creation of the United States Department of Agriculture, which has historically discriminated against Black, Indigenous, and other farmers of color who were pushed off their land by decades of racially biased laws and practices. For example, Black farmers have shared stories that the USDA officials, especially local loan authorities, have treated them very poorly, have threw loan applications in the trash, and illegally denied them loans. This has happened for decades through at least the 1990s. When the USDA's local offices did approve loans for Black farmers, they often were done with a paternalistic supervision, meaning that Black farmers couldn't spend the money that they borrowed without receiving an item by item authorization from the USDA, or they received money late. And in farming, we know that timing is everything. So meanwhile, white farmers were receiving unsupervised on-time loans. Many say that the egregious discrimination by local loan officials persists to this day. So any discussion about race in the USDA has to start with the crisis of Black land loss. Although the US government never followed through on its promise to freed slaves of 40 acres and a mule, Black folks were able to establish a foothold in Southern agriculture. Black land ownership peaked in 1910 when 218,000 African-American farmers had an ownership stake in 15 million acres of land. But by 1992, those numbers had dwindled to just 2.3 million acres of land held by only 18,000 Black farmers. This wasn't because farming was declining as a way of life, mind you. Black folks were being pushed off the land in vastly disproportionate numbers, oftentimes at gunpoint. In 1920, 1 out of 7 farmers in the US were Black run, and by 1992, 1 out of 100 farms were Black run. Farmland ownership is highly consolidated and racialized due to this long history of attempted genocide, eugenics, dispossession, and slavery. Today, 8% of farms control over 40% of the land in the US, farmland. The average American farm now is over 400 acres compared to that 150 acres in 1940. And the number increases every year as smaller farms buckle under the weight of capital-intensive industrial agriculture. There's also an extreme racial disparity between who labors on the land and who profits from it. Over 60% of farm workers are people of color, largely Latinx, and meanwhile, white folks own 98% of all farmland, or about 50 times the number of acres owned by people of color. So this is a pretty stark demographic to show, and this is showing by state the percentage of farmers in each state. As you can see, the percentage of farmers in Vermont is about 98.5% versus about 1.5% of farmers of color. So just taking a look at this, the average percent of 1.5% per state versus that overwhelmingly white majority, these are all quite a few multi-generational farmers. Keep these numbers in mind when you think about how land is inherited, and in fact, that farmers are increasingly aging and getting over the age of 65. So this does not bode well for many reasons, but it doesn't bode well for farmland preservation in general, but it also doesn't bode well for balancing equity in farming when many families are ready to take an exit from farming and taking payouts based on the land values that are based on development versus farming, instead of continuing the family tradition. This makes farmland access out of reach for farmers of color and puts good soils, our food system, and our environment at risk. Couple that with the impacts of COVID right now, and we're starting to see some really stark issues. So 1.4% of the population are Black folks, for example, in Vermont, but 10 times that are getting sick from COVID because Dr. Stephen Leffler of the University of Vermont Medical Center, he states that people of color may live in more densely built housing with more family or roommates and have greater reliance on mass transit, leaving them more exposed to the virus than their white neighbors. And combine that with a 34% increased likelihood of comorbidities, often due to chronic stress of just living in a Black or brown body, and including the effects of food security. And that really lands people of color in the hospital at a disproportionate rate for COVID. Now, there's one thing I wanted to note, just as sort of an anecdote, and a lot of folks, I used to live in Vermont actually, and there's this sort of overwhelmingly white demographic in Vermont, but folks are always kind of like wondering why Vermont is so white. So around the 20th century, there was a bunch of out-migration, people leaving their farms, and there was a lot of discussion about who to recruit to work on those farms. The preferred farmer was actually of Teutonic origin, so German or Scandinavian. And this is a quote from the US Census Superintendent Francis Walker in 1882 that shares that when you're looking for people to take over an abandoned farm, you weren't thinking about like trying to recruit former African-American sharecroppers from the US South, but wanting somebody who's Swedish, Norwegian, or somebody from Minnesota, for example. So basically naming a preference for white farmers to come and take over these farms. Couple that with things like the eugenics program in Vermont and the erasure of indigeneity in Vermont. I actually was vying for a position to become a caretaker at a retreat center in Vermont, and the person who interviewed me for the position asked me why I wanted to live in a state that had no Native American people in it. And it just immediately triggered this, wow, the eugenics program actually did its job, right? It did its job, it erased Indigenous identity on the land in Vermont. So just thinking about those things as to why the state is overwhelmingly white, it isn't because of preference, it's because of all the different systemic reasons and systemic inequities that folks hold and keep in their internal bias. You can go to the next slide, there we go. So I'd like to introduce two wonderful people. We're gonna move into some case studies because this isn't really about me, it's about our farmers of color. So two wonderful people that we work with at NEFOC. The first case study is based on the land access experience of one of our board members, Christine Hutchinson. Christine doesn't own land and doesn't have capital to access land. She's relied on the kindness of well-intended landowners who have offered her quote unquote handshake deals to farm on their land. Her experiences have informed her work with helping build the NEFOC Land Trust. The second case study is with Omar Hassan. He's a cooperative development and marketing specialist with a partner who we work with, Cooperative Development Institute. And Omar is going to share his experience supporting new American farmers in New England. We work alongside Omar to offer technical assistance for farmers of color through our Strengthening Our Roots Farmers Exchange. Omar is going to offer you some simple shifts you can make as an organization to ensure you're meeting the needs of new American refugee and migrant farmers.
Hi, I'm Christine Hutchinson, a high school teacher based in Newburgh, New York. I'm a Northeast Farmers of Color Network member and an inaugural board member for the NEFOC Land Trust. I also direct a small nonprofit called Our Core, which serves to empower marginalized young people to uplift themselves and others through experiential and academic education. Our vision is a community that is devoid of oppression of any kind. In Our Core's agricultural-led program, we take young people who are disconnected from their food, the land on which it's grown, and we bring them to the land in their own city to teach them how to grow food and care for the land. We foster their interests, personal investment, and self-confidence. We nurture the most interested young people's agricultural aspirations in hopes that they'll take up the charge of feeding their communities. We need land to be able to answer the question, now what? Once these young people have gone through the program, developed their confidence, they have skills, they've made personal investments, where do they grow? The people who have access to land are the people who have the money to pay for it or who have connections to legal and governmental resources that have provided countless acres of land for personal consumption. Black people have historically not been party to these resources. In present day, they're subject to the whims of those who have. As a fledgling poultry farmer myself, I was fortunate to gain access to land because a person who inherited 65 acres deemed me worthy of his generosity. He took me under his wing, gave me free rein over his barn, fenced yard, and many acres of pasture. Unfortunately, there was a person there who made it his mission to sabotage me and the relationship I'd been building with the farmer. I had a large flock of egg-laying birds, and many days I would have no eggs. I had a cow somehow end up in the middle of the pasture with my chickens, destroying my equipment and eating my feed. And finally, this person started to make claims that things were being stolen from the farm. And I've seen this movie before, and now we all know how a small issue can turn into death or jail for a Black person. So I took my cue and I left that space. That stopped any progression that I was making toward being a poultry farmer, but it didn't stop my desire to find land sovereignty and food sovereignty, particularly for Black people. I channeled all my efforts into Our Core, and as Our Core has sought to build a youth-led urban farm in Newburgh, a piece of land was identified. And after a consultation with the owner, he initially promised to donate this land to Our Core. Then, with no further conversation, he backed that promise down to a low-cost lease. And after a month of hammering out details on this lease with his agent, he decided he didn't want to even offer the security of a lease. But he did want Our Core's kids to go there and plant what he wanted on his property. Because systemic racism takes many different paths, but always lands at a destination where Black people don't have land access, it is important for Black farmers that we rethink this system. In order to grant people of color access to land and a place to grow, we need a new model, and the Northeast Farmers of Color is that new model.
Hi, everybody. It's Stephanie. I'm here with Omar Hassan from Cooperative Development Institute. Omar is a cooperative development and marketing assistant, and he has been working with NEFOC Land Trust on refugee and migrant farmers Skillshare series that has been happening in Maine, and we have 2 more to go over the next 2 years. So I met Omar last year, and we've been working together to develop a Skillshare for farmers and community. Omar, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your role, and what you do for the Somali Bantu farming community?
Hi, my name is Omar Hassan. I work at Cooperative Development Institute. I am the Cooperative Development Marketing Assistant. And so I work with the New Roots Cooperative Farm and also other farmers in the Lewiston and Auburn area. I've joined CDI mainly to do a cooperative farming, cooperative food system work.
Tell me more about the Farmers Exchange that we're working on together. How have these Farmers Exchanges affected or help the community with the self-determination model that you're talking about?
Yeah, so we've had many groups, many farmers, individuals, people in the community, leaders come together, people of color, to share themselves. Some of them are, looking to start a farm, and some of them already have. So we have kind of mixed them together with the help of many, service providers and, you know, other people that can support in ways to bring them together. So this was a chance to actually be people of color talking to each other and actually exchange things that, they wouldn't share amongst others. So, and it was so amazing. They were, they speak the same, some of them speak the same language, and they were able to, talk to each other after, and, and also in the session. That also gave me a chance to just like say, we have, developed and created something that can be a year round every year. So it's like some of them came back, called, and some of them know each other. It's like they've learned so much, and they've also appreciated the fact that they can do things on their own.
I really appreciate that part of the work that we've been doing with CDI, that we're working toward this development of an owner operated businesses and building these cooperatives that, like you're saying, it's breaking down the isolation, especially around language access and language justice. What do you think some of the tools for, what are some of the tools of land access that you've seen happen, as far as how have these farmers been accessing land, and does it feel stable to you? Does it feel like this land access is increasing for farmers of color in these regions?
Yeah, I mean, we're changing we're seeing some changes, obviously, but slow. But I think we're progressing to the right direction. For example, Somali Bantu Community Association has just fundraised land that's 107 acres. They're able to just fundraise all the way, and that was a right direction. Obviously, the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement have had a positive impact, huge impact on Black farmers and immigrant farmers. So many were able to donate, many were able to support in some ways, volunteer, and just coming forward to see them succeed as well. So obviously, I know there's a lot of demand in seeing farmers produce. So I think there's a win-win on both sides. We need it. Many people want farmers. Many people want farmers to succeed as well. So producing and just staying away from because there were a lot of things were shifting. There were a lot of changes, uncertainty. That people were just not sure. Obviously, the farmers also were not sure that they were going to make through the pandemic, but through the support, I think many have seen that there's hope.
That's so great to hear, and I feel that the Black Lives Matter movement has definitely added to this movement becoming a movement. It's not just a moment, but we're actually seeing some really amazing changes on the ground. You're talking to an audience of farm services providers and land trusts. Who do you, if you wanted to give them some feedback about what they can do in their own organizations to uplift farmers of color, what would you suggest that they do?
I mean, yeah, I think reaching out to folks, local organizations that actually have a lot of experience and know what they're doing. And it's, I think obviously the farmers, it's all on them to see if they want to take on what they need to take on. I think also people providing the services need to also reach out. I think the farmers don't do a lot of outreaches, and they don't know, and there's a lot of barriers. Obviously, the language has a lot of impact on how they can communicate through others. So it all depends. I'll say the farmers need to. I think that the barrier may have a big impact, but also I would challenge. I would challenge that the service providers be more supportive in bringing on more people of color.
I feel like you have so much experience, and we barely touched the surface of what you do as far as marketing. And I'm wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit about how you approach marketing and what you do as a marketing specialist.
Yeah, so the last 3 years I worked with New Roots and also Isuken lately through marketing and doing coordination as well. And I've seen that having someone like me in the middle that can speak both languages helps a lot, rather than having someone at the marketing coordination and then having an interpreter. And then so there's like 3 layers of communication, which can also mean that management can also fall apart easily if somebody that don't speak the language is doing that process. And the farmers they feel comfortable just having to know that, oh, communicate to this person easily, that person can be communicated in. So a lot of communication, if there is like something that needs to be translated, it will be a slow market for them, and they will not grow fast. I think that's something I've seen the last few years as well. So this is the second year with New Roots, and I think seeing the growth that, I mean, it's enormous. The work, they're taking on more. They're able to take on more, and also I'll say the same for Isuken Co-op, who is also growing and also expanding their market.
And one last question, I would say, what is the power of the co-op behind the work that you're doing, as far as the model of a cooperative model versus another type of farming model?
Yeah, so I mean, being able to share, being able to decide, being able to just be together, also, like help each other. I think, that togetherness, sharing, and also being able to just, live the dream without having to do more by yourself. A lot of people, just seeing how powerful that could be, and New have already shown that to the community here in Lewiston.
That's great. Thank you so much, Omar. It's been really great to chat with you.
Thank you.
So just recapping some of the things that jumped out for me during my conversation with Omar is that there's a key focus on self-determination that really is values aligned with Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. And one of the reasons that we chose to partner with CDI on this is because of some of the things that Omar mentioned, which is that it's always about building self-determination in community. It's about building relationship with community and reaching out to community instead of coming up with an idea that you think is the best idea for community or for farmers of color, and then simply just offering those services to actually engage the community and build relationships, and then, you know, find out what it is that they need and what they're naming. We actually did something similar with our pre-engagement survey for the Strengthening Our Roots Farmers Exchange, for example, and kind of assumed that folks were going to be looking for Skillshare actually about working in a different climate, and that's not what they wanted at all. They wanted to be able to access larger markets and help with marketing. So it was a really beneficial thing to engage both through relationship building and then through a survey that was delivered by a community member who can speak the language. So the other piece that Omar shares is that, you know, quite often people will hire translators for certain things, but that's not necessarily building capacity in a community or building capacity for farmers of color. What that's doing is just seeing somebody as a way to translate translate information or using them as an extractive mechanism. Basically, what the best practice right now is in co-creative work is about hiring in community and building capacity in that community. So Omar is a member of that community, speaks the language, has the knowledge and the training to be able to help his community with markets and marketing and cooperative development. So he just seems to be the best fit for that work. And it's also increasing the effectiveness of the programming. Going back to Christine's video, this is it's a very, very pervasive situation and unfortunate situation of these handshake deals that basically kind of catalyzed the way that we developed this land trust, and the fact that we actually are doing this work is based on some of those handshake deals. So well-intentioned landowners approach us more often than anybody else. They want to share land, but they want to share land on their terms. So it's been really hard, because donation of land is one thing, right? Or purchase of land is one thing. That means that you have the title, you can do what you want. Whereas a lot of landowners, I would say about 75% of the emails that I receive regarding land are about this model of handshake deal. I want to welcome your farmers of color onto my land, but they can't do this, this, and this, and I want them to do this, this, and this, and I also want to have a cut of the proceeds of anything that they make off of farming the land. That's actually something called sharecropping. So folks don't, I think, realize that that's really going into that model of something that's a harmful way of, there's no reciprocity there. So sharecropping, bootstrap mentality, and literal to no culturally competent, just like that farmer advocacy work, that it's really becoming, it became very apparent to the 350 farmers of color across the Northeast who wanted the land trust built, that this is one of the reasons that the land trust needed to be built. So getting into that, I wanted to just get to the next section. So this is a photo of our gathering. Oh, no, you can go back. Yep, there you go. This is our 2019 August New Folk Network gathering at Soulfire Farm in Stockbridge, Muncie, Mohican land. And this is a small subset of farmers of color across the Northeast who got together last year. This was our last Skillshare before COVID, unfortunately. So we were really hoping to meet this summer, but unfortunately that was not possible due to COVID. We have been doing Skillshares online, offering mutual aid and mutual support and training in many different ways, but I'd love to have more pictures of us together soon. So today's barriers and challenges for farmers of color come in many shapes and sizes, but are founded in the systemic racist history that we talked about briefly earlier. From enslavement and land theft to lack of access to patient capital, unfair, casual, and paternalistic lease agreements, heirs property, and redlining, this is why NEFOC Land Trust exists today, to connect farmers of color with permanent, secure land tenure despite the history of anything but. This is where land trust and farmer services organizations come in. We are the gatekeepers to farmland access and the services needed to make a life on land. The Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust is working every day to address these disparities in land access. I ask one question of you as we embark upon this training today. Sorry, I have a frog in my throat. I'm going to ask one question of you. Who are the farmers of color in your community? If you don't have any farmers of color in your community, ask yourself why. And how are you working beside them every day to ensure this legacy of history and racism and oppression ends with you and your organization? So that was 3 questions, but still. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Nefolk Land Trust was established in 2019 to manifest a simple and beautiful vision: to advance land sovereignty in the Northeast region through permanent and secure land tenure for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian farmers and land stewards who will work with the land in a sacred manner that honors our ancestors' dreams for sustainable farming, human habitat, ceremony, native species ecosystem restoration, and cultural preservation. The Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust is a hybrid model land trust, bringing together a community land trust commons model for farmland preservation and a conservation land trust model to conserve and steward ecosystems, with the goal of manifesting a community vision that uplifts regenerative global Indigenous, Black, and POC relationships with land, skills, and lifeways. So you'll take a look at the strategies that we have for programming here. And I wanted to point out a lot of the work that we do, and I think the goal or the core of the work that we do is built in relationship building and interdependence between organizations. And I really hope that this model can evoke a sense of collaboration, really. And that's really what this is, and why Nefolk Land Trust exists is to create overlapping communities of support. And you can see here, this is sort of the Venn diagram of our inaugural programming. So we're about to unveil this phase in our programming. And honestly, you're the first people outside of yesterday's New Hampshire training and our board of directors to see this model. We're advancing permanent and secure land tenure through 3 inaugural programs: the Community Conservation, Land Network and Relationships, Resources, and Reciprocity programs. And when we say community, we mean community including human beings as well as more than human beings. We're steadily on our way to farmland acquisition and land access for farmers, as well as the development of farmer training, resources, and community. We're also working to conserve land through protecting native species ecosystems, engaging in uplifting and centering regenerative farming and agroforestry, and advancing environmental policy that upholds the rights of nature, which is also known as personhood. Our land trust always centers BIPOC voices and leadership and honors Indigenous sovereignty while healing colonial harm and protecting our future by creating a carbon drawdown of the Northeast. So what makes us unique? There's a motto that there's a whole bunch of different varied origins of this statement: for us, by us, and nothing about us without us. But that's truly the core of this model, is that we are building this land trust with our own communities, for our own communities, and we want to be involved in anything that has to do with our communities. So this is a hybrid model, as I shared earlier. It's kind of a combination between a community land trust model and a conservation land trust model. The community land trust part is addressing farmland preservation, Black land loss, Indigenous land theft. We're creating common spaces. All of this is to allow for permanent, secure, and heritable land tenure and cooperative business development. The conservation land trust piece is enabling conservation and restoration of native species ecosystems while trying to figure out how to work with settler species and invasive species. Culturally significant lands are held in a sacred and culturally congruent manner, and we're also advancing our personhood goals. All of this is to result in the health, wealth, and joy of our communities, to be able to create healthy, permanently accessible land, healthy communities growing our own foods and medicines, joyful honoring of our cultural lifeways, native species ecosystems that are in balance with settler and introduced species, and also ultimately a new economic system that builds, reclaims, and shares wealth. We're trying to sequester carbon into the soil, and we're ultimately respecting creation as a living being. And when we say creation, we mean nature, which we are a part of. We're not above or below. So I think there was one before that. Oh no, that is it. So I just wanted to get into one more thing, if you want to go back really quickly, to what makes Nefolk Land Trust unique. And this is something, it's sort of on here in the idea of respecting the sovereignty of Indigenous people. But I just wanted to mention that some of the things that really stand out that we've been addressed or people get into contact with us for are around our decentralized leadership system, which we're still building. We have a co-directorship model. We also are instituting an Indigenous consultation and partnerships protocol. So what that means is we're really addressing that terra nullius sort of doctrine of discovery issue around this being unceded territory. And knowing that this is unceded territory, we want to ensure that we are consulting, not just consulting, but really partnering with Indigenous peoples, all the Indigenous nations who still remain in their homelands, as well as those who have been forcibly relocated. And we'll talk a little bit more about ways to partner with Indigenous nations later on in the presentation. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So we have this sort of, based on the last 2 years, we've built this sort of phased tools and resources idea that we're kind of unveiling in this, in a more formal way in this presentation. And this is based on the inquiry that we've received from multiple organizations in the Northeast who are all feeling the same urgency all at the same time. So we started getting contacted by organizations when NEFOC Land Trust came into fruition in 2019. But as of May 25th, 2020, that communication, I would say, with folks reaching out with urgent requests to help them with building equity, diversity, and inclusion profiles, statements, programs, reaching out to BIPOC farmers, that was the day that all started happening for us. And that's one of the reasons, if you email me, you get an out of office responder saying that I'll be slow to respond, because my inbox blew up with urgent requests from hundreds of organizations looking to connect with farmers of color, looking to connect with us to figure out how they can do better. We don't have the time or the capacity to handle those requests. So this is one way that we can build a little bit of a kernel into, ways that you can explore these things. So the first phase is the unlearning and relearning phase. It sounds like quite a few of you have already done this, which is great. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but just to, Jamie's going to share some links into the chat around some of the really valuable and just really condensed platforms that name multiple action steps to being able to work from an anti-oppressive framework. First, there's individual work. You want to first start with yourself. You want to make sure that you've been doing anti-oppression and anti-racism training that is uplifted by BIPOC organizations. So ensuring that those trainers are folks who we trust and we know. And then developing an understanding of those actionable steps to food and land sovereignty by taking a look at some of these platforms that Jamie is sharing. There's so many things to think about within here. But one of them that I would mention is taking a look at a resource on the resources guide that we're going to be sharing with you later about white supremacist culture. And one of the key tenets of white supremacist culture, one of the keystones to that culture, is urgency and pace setting. So I want to talk about that because it's what we've been experiencing at NEFOC is a sense of urgency and a sense of pace setting that actually it comes from or stems from that white supremacist mindset. It's the first thing that you need to unlearn, or what is white supremacist culture and what are we doing organizationally that might mirror that, or personally. So we're basically saying, put the brakes on, let's do this in phases. There's a point where we can partner with you, but first these things need to happen. Additionally, organizationally, same thing, group training, anti-oppression training with all levels of leadership, including CEOs, boards of directors. Everybody needs to be on board for this for it to work. Here, there are two different collectives that I can mention that are doing anti-oppression training. First is the Aorta Collective, as well as the Kingston Land Trust is now doing an anti-oppression training and offering technical assistance to land-based organizations. So check them out. One way that you can help is also to offer some pro bono technical assistance, and that's sort of building that relationship. So folks like us who are new and have little access to capital, little access to resources, we need that technical assistance to make this successful. And we also want to build relationships with you. That's a great place to do it. The second phase is called organizational embodiment. And this is really where you're taking everything that you've learned. And as we know, I think there's been a few articles out there now about this concept of reading anti-oppression books and articles is really not doing anything, that it's actually, you know, it's creating more harm than good because people say, oh, I've done my work and I don't need to do anything else. But if you don't take that reading and that training and put it into actionable steps, actionable mechanisms within yourself and your organization, it's basically all for naught. So really thinking about how can you embody everything that you've unlearned and relearned in a way that manifests itself in organizational spaces. So consulting with anti-oppression specialists for equitable ground leases, like Christine was saying, you know, she could have really used somebody that could have advocated for her during that time. Partnering or approaching us for partnership with BIPOC-led organizations and donating land and easements. Those are all things that you can help as far as land access is concerned. And then organizationally, you know, starting with those equity statements and working groups who really are working out, not only, as you can tell or see from our land acknowledgement earlier, built into that statement are actionable mechanisms that we're embodying as an organization to honor Indigenous sovereignty. So thinking about how can we as an organization embody our equity statements, and then building accountability mechanisms into that, potentially with compensated advisory councils, with folks you built relationships with in your area, depending on where your service area is. And then also one other way that is really a wonderful way to offer support is to offer fiscal sponsorship to and free labor to BIPOC-led organizations who have less access to resources. And the third phase is deepening that engagement. So this is really where we get into where we're going to jump off now, which is some of the things that NEFOC is doing that are really steeped in anti-oppressive mechanisms and applying those things to the land trust space and farmer services space. So these are ways that we're offering that you can share, and I'll share some of those in detail in just a little bit. But again, working with BIPOC-led organizations like us to offer and advocate for equitable ground leases. The repatriation of land is one that's coming up a lot lately. Donation of land and easements, and then also the creation of BIPOC-specific land access programs led by people of color. Within your organization, that would mean that you're taking a look at your leadership models and your staffing models and ensuring that you have people of color to lead those programs, to create reparations programming and voluntary taxation mechanisms in partnership with Indigenous peoples, other ways of partnering with Indigenous peoples, specifically around personhood, the rights of nature, cultural respect easements, which we're going to talk a little bit about, and also offering BIPOC-specific farmer services that are built in partnership with BIPOC staff. So this is where we get into some of the ways that NEFOC is actually embodying our anti-oppressive mechanisms, and these are sort of like where to jump off from in that green section. So you want to make sure that you're ready, that your organization is ready, that you've put in the accountability mechanisms that are in place, that you have people of color working for you. That's when these things can be more appropriate. So the first thing would be partnership with Indigenous nations. And that's something that NEFOC takes very seriously. We're not just in a consultative phase with Indigenous nations, but actually working to stand next to each other and uplift each other. And that's one way of honoring sovereignty. Some of the other ways that we're manifesting those partnerships are through repatriation of land and holding repatriated land in trust for certain collectives who are maybe not necessarily ever going to form a 501c3. One example would be, we haven't solidified any of these yet, so I don't want to get ahead of myself and announcing anything. We'll probably announce those soon, but we're working with a group in Wabanaki territory who are receiving repatriated land, and as an act of reciprocity, our organization will be holding the title to that land for them. We're obviously doing the consultation piece, which is around, recognizing what the territory is that the land holding is on. And as a first step, along with an environmental review and a search and survey and all the other things that come along with that, which, I don't need to teach you about, this is really that added mechanism of saying, well, this is Abenaki territory, and who are the Abenaki leadership in this territory, and do they have food sovereignty program? programming do they have, what are their needs, and engaging those communities and leaders to let them know what you're doing, that you're transacting upon their land, and that this is their territory. What do they want to see happen with this? So that's all about relationship building, very, very deep relationship building. I would never suggest to engage an Indigenous leader or Indigenous community cold and just and do it in that extractive way. This is all about relationship building and thinking about at every step of the turn, and you will do this if you've gone through these trainings. Am I extracting from these people? Like, what is the purpose for why I'm getting in touch, and what is the outcome that I want to see, versus how can I uplift the sovereignty of these people, and what is the outcome that they want to see? The final is the land tax, and there's a lot of land tax models out there, but these are for, again, unceded territories where there are land claims active, or just unceded territories in general, where those First Nations are, you're all living on that land and you're paying municipal tax, but you're not actually honoring the fact that this is Abenaki land. So, for example, there's the Segority Land Trust in California who's doing a really wonderful, it's called the Shumi Land Tax Program. And that land, it's a voluntary land tax that residents of the Bay Area participate in. And there's a land tax calculator and all these other mechanisms to ensure that you can figure out what you can afford and what you should be paying. So that's really helped them build capacity, not only for the land trust, but for community food resilience. It's been wonderful. Lizelle Haynes here is speaking to the Oneida Repatriation of land. That's my people. And Lizelle repatriated a few acres of land back to the Oneida people. She says, I've lived on Oneida lands for 43 years and inherited this land from my mother. When I heard Michelle Shenandoah, about the Oneida women gathering on their homelands and the desire to have a place of their own, I knew this was the right thing to do. So just thinking about the legacy and the history and what you want to leave behind. The next step would be looking at reparations, right? So there's the bill, HR 40 reparations bill. We're all addressing these in different ways, but thinking about the reparations mechanism, reparations policy, and if you have any internal reparations policies for your organization. This can be done in many ways. It can be done as far as building in a reparations mechanism or organizationally for, say, workshop entry fees. That's a really good one, you know, or conference entry fee, and ensuring that BIPOC organizers and land activists and farmers have equitable access to learning spaces. So that's a great way to create a reparations program internally, as well as larger reparations programming. You can see here in the background, this is the NEFOC Network's Reparations Map for Black and Indigenous farmers. And you can find that on our website. It'll be in the resource guide that Jamie shares with everybody. And what this is it's a peer-to-peer reparations mechanism that was built by the NEFOC Network back in 2018. And we administer that, the applications to that map. We're actually in the middle of revamping the map a little bit, renaming it. We want to make sure that we're honoring Bill HR 40 and the reparations bill. But right now it's still called the Reparations Map. And what it is it's a peer-to-peer reparations mechanism where people farmers of color and land-based BIPOC folks are able to basically put their project on this map and say what they need, along with a way to contact them to offer reparations. We've had money being given to folks to build capacity in their farms. We've had this past spring, somebody received a large freezer unit to freeze their poultry. We've had land given to folks. One herbal collective received enough money to be able to build a mobile herbal unit that went around reservations in underserved communities and continues to do that. It's really an amazing tool, and it's something that we can, you know, it's just sort of a flagship, like a fledgling idea. But so think about that. Okay, and this is one that's very popular. A lot of folks are starting to contact us about this. We're definitely not the experts in this, but we are certainly working with the cultural respect easement and cultural use agreement idea. And we're going to move into a case study that really breaks this down. But just to give you an idea of what happens with these, there is a no trespassing sign that's on many properties. And what that's doing is telling people like me, right now I'm on my homelands, that I cannot access certain parts of my homelands to pick medicines, to grow food, to hunt, to harvest. So this is a method of not only building relationship, but also offering a space for Indigenous hands to come back to the land. And I'm going to let Leah Penneman share her experience with doing that with the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican in this next video.
So Leah, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, friend, and our guest presenter, Leah Penneman. Leah is a Black Creole farmer, paysan, mother, soil nerd, author, and food justice activist from Soulfire Farm in Grafton, New York. She co-founded Soulfire Farm in 2010 with the mission to end racism in the food system and reclaim our ancestral connection to the land. Leah is a part of a team that facilitates powerful food sovereignty programs, including the farmer training for Black and Brown growers, reparations and land return initiatives for Northeast farmers, food justice workshops for urban youth, home gardens for city dwellers living under food apartheid, doorstep harvest delivery for food insecure households, and systems policy education for public decision makers. Leah has been farming since 1996 and holds an MA in Science Education and a Bachelor's in Environmental Science and International Development from Clark University, and is a Manye or Queen Mother in Vodun. Leah trained at Many Hands Organic Farm in Farm School, Massachusetts, and internationally with farmers in Ghana, Haiti, and Mexico. She also served as a high school biology and environmental science teacher for 17 years. The work of Leah and Soulfire Farm has been recognized by the Soros Racial Justice Fellowship, Fulbright Program, Grist 50, and James Beard Leadership Award. And I know that you're also nominated for something else very special that maybe you can share with folks now too. And her book, Farming While Black, which I would say is your seminal work, Leah, is also is Soulfire Farm's Practical Guide to Liberation on Land, is a love song for the land and her people. So let's welcome Leah Penneman. Thank you so much for being here, Leah. I'm just going to pull my screen share down and you can share your screen.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you to the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. It's been a multi-year journey now of coming to know, and I would venture to say love and care for one another. I just have such deep respect for this network and the sacred work of rematriation that you all do, and just very, very, very honored to get to talk about our humble way that we attempt to engage with reimagining relationship to land. So thank you, everyone. So something very exciting that I want to mention, because it finally got approved last week, and I also got written permission from the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Council to share this with you all. So I'm very excited, as we've been working on what's called the cultural respect easement. And for some context, the idea of an easement is that it is a little clause, right, that's attached to the property ownership deed, and it usually grants or restricts rights. So examples of easements that are more common include, like, we have an easement from our neighbor to run a power line through their property so electricity can get to our land, right? That's an easement. And so it's both on their deed and our deed that we have this right to use their land for that wire. Another example of an easement you might have heard of is like a conservation easement. So that's a restriction. I could sell or donate a conservation easement to our local land trust that would say, 60 acres of woods back there will never be developed. I am giving away or selling the development rights, and so that's permanently protected, and that reduces my property value, so I get like some maybe tax benefits. I get brownie points for good citizenship, whatever. A cultural respect easement is a newer tool, and I know that there are Indigenous nations in California, as well as Massachusetts and Maine, who have really piloted and created this concept, but it grants certain use rights to the original people of the land. And in the case of this easement, we had talked to the folks at the Mohican Nation, who were generous enough to give us their time. I'm sure they get all kinds of weird whack requests, and I made a couple of visits out to the reservation, got to know the folks of the Cultural Council, got to know the few families that are living in the homelands who aren't in Wisconsin. They're part of our solidarity share, so we're delivering food to families at no cost who are here in their homelands, and just really trying to follow folks' lead while many of us are Indigenous. No one in our co-op is Mohican or Haudenosaunee, so this is not our territory. We are settlers here. And we asked them, like, do you want to be co-owners in the co-op or whatnot? And that was a no for various logistical reasons, but they were interested in a cultural respect easement, which would grant permanent use rights to the commons area of the land, so the forest and the waters, for ceremony, for fires and wildcrafting, hunting, fishing, burial of sacred artifacts that have been retrieved from museums that need to be reburied. And so we worked on this agreement, and again, back and forth with lawyers to figure out what's right. And the way that we decided to do it is right now, we just signed a 5-year agreement to give us a chance to tweak anything that's not working. And then after 5 years, it will become permanent, like forever and ever, and it will be recorded in the county along with the deed. And so that means that even, you know, when I eventually pass, or when Soul Fire Farm is no longer here, no matter who is owning this land, that easement for the Mohican Nation will be intact, which is really the idea. The idea is not a courtesy visit for original people, but it's that there's actually use rights to the land.
So this is a great place. I know we only have about 12 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that we touched on some partnership ideas as well as just do some Q&A. But the last piece that I wanted to touch on is this concept of partnerships. And this is where I just want to uplift 2 partnerships that we're participating in right now that kind of spell out different ways that you can engage with BIPOC organizations. The first one, if you want to go to the next slide, is this is a BIPOC specific partnership. So this is something we call the ecosystem, and this is a partnership between Soul Fire Farm, the Farm School in New York City, Nefolk Land Trust, Black Farmer Fund, and Corbin Hill Food Project. And this is about building a racially just food system in New York State. So each one of our overlapping services is creating something that will engage success and ensure success for farmers making a life on land. Soul Fire and Farm School are offering the education and training needed. Black Farmer Fund and Corbin Hill are offering access to capital and markets, and then we're offering the land access piece. And if you put those all together, there's a much higher hope or incidence of success on land. So we're beginning to flesh that partnership out right now with a facilitated, we've been working on it already, but we're doing facilitated vision and values building calls and some planning calls. The next partnership, if you want to go to the next slide, is a Vermont-specific partnership that is a multi-organization partnership in advancing BIPOC farmer success and BIPOC land access in Vermont. This is a partnership between Vermont Land Trust and NOFA Vermont, and it was founded on really deep relationship building. So this is something where, you know, folks didn't just sort of like get in touch with me and say, hey, do you want to do this? This is actually built on continued conversations, on meeting, on having conversations offline that didn't really have anything to do with one specific thing. It was more about how can we get to know each other and how can we build together. And this is what manifested out of one of those relationships was this grant. So we're hoping to engage 8 farmers of color over the next 2 years, I believe, to ensure that they access the business planning and financial planning services they need in order to ensure success on land. So this is our beloved Fannie Lou Hamer. I wanted to just finish this presentation by letting you know that our work is really deeply rooted in the philosophy and values that folks like community organizer and farmer Fannie Lou Hamer really inspired. And she could say it better than I ever could, and much more simply: nobody's free until everybody's free. Let that be the call to action that binds us in this work. I want to thank you again for being here, for participating, for being interested, and I'm happy to answer questions if I'm able. Also, my email address, or this Nefolk Land Trust email address, will be shared if you have any questions or want to reach out. But right now, I'd like to just take a little bit of, if anybody has questions, this is a good time. I know we only have 10 minutes, but here we go. Let's see. Catherine Helmer: I'm unfamiliar with the term repatriation, but I'd like to be. Can you explain what that means? Sure. very simple. So repatriation is something that is an idea that is about returning sacred items to a nation. So one example would be the wampum belts that we have for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. They've been displayed in museums. They're not meant to be displayed in museums. There are many cultural artifacts that are actually sacred items that our ancestors, or our ancestors themselves, actually, many of the bones of our ancestors are held in museums on display as well. Part of this has been about taking and giving those items back to the nations for reburial or other things. Because the land in Indigenous communities is considered female, quote unquote, we use the term rematriation, and that was something that was coined a few years ago. I actually don't know if the source was Eve Tuck or somebody else, but it feels very appropriate. Melissa Gordon's asking, what are more examples of policies that can support BIPOC land ownership or that hinder it and could be changed? For example, ag land tax rates might only apply to parcels greater than 5 acres, but beginning farmers often have smaller parcels, so would removing that acreage minimum help folks to afford land? Or are other policies related to access to credit and loans, property inheritance? I hear what you're saying. Some simple answers would be yes, that, you know, that's a great idea. And also one thing that we mentioned, or that we've been coming into, running into a lot with a lot of service providers, for example, is what equates with a farmer, and what constitutes a farmer. Oftentimes farmers, to be able to be eligible for certain programming, need to make a certain threshold of income from farming. And as you know, farmers of color, we operate on smaller scale, often on a regenerative scale, sometimes in agroforestry models, and those are growing and building for sure. And we, for example, the grant that I just mentioned, this partnership grant, the minimum income to be eligible for the services, I believe, was $15,000 of net income a year. And for example, I think it's New York State is the one I have the most data on, but it's very similar in the other states. For example, Black farmers, there's a huge disparity in the income, net income of farmers of color. There's I think, $42,000 annually in net income for white farmers versus a negative $900 a year for Black farmers. So they would be ineligible for those services. So thinking about that when you're offering programs, like how do farmers of color, like what are their needs? And, you know, thinking about thresholds, thinking about small scale farming, thinking about land tax, thinking about no ownership whatsoever. How can we make it easier? How can we facilitate those things? By taking a look at your existing profile and your existing, what's governing these things, and offering some alternatives and solutions. Let's see, and Molly Anderson is asking, is there a national network of organizations facilitating BIPOC land ownership? Not right now. We're building with other organizations and grassroots collectives actually as we speak. We're hosting in the next little while, in the beginning of 2021, a BIPOC land access convergence that is actually engaging BIPOC led organizations, BIPOC grassroots collectives, all dedicated to land access, to get us all in the same room together to discuss whether this is necessary. If there is a national network, there should be a national network of organizations, most likely. We're fleshing that out all together. But there are things like the Southern Federation of Cooperatives and other different sort of regional organizations who are all participating in these conversations. Okay, and do you have a definition of secure land tenure in the absence of being able to own land outright? Right, so, oh, you're welcome, Molly. The definition that we're seeing right now is the model that we're building at NEFOC, which is more about holding these ground leases in perpetuity. You can build improvements on the land, you can sell the homes that are on the land. And what we're doing internally with our policy is ensuring that there's reparations policies and all these other aspects that will ensure land held in perpetuity. So one of the ways we're doing that is through 501c3, 501c2, two-tier community land trust model. And what happens with that is there's a whole set of bylaws that are enacted. There's a board that is a part of that. It's much more like a cooperative land tenureship. The recording will be available. Let's see, and I know there was one other, Jen, did you have one other question you wanted me to ask, Jamie, or answer? Let's see, BIPOC, how can we reach out to BIPOC leaders and community members in our area? Well, if you don't know any, there may not be any, it's a little hard because you want to make sure that you're going through the steps first, right? Don't use that reparations map as a way to reach out to BIPOC farmers. That's not appropriate. If that's meant specifically to offer peer-to-peer reparations. And let's see, I would say if you're looking to reach out, we're building an extensive network database and membership, but I guess it would be, why do you want to reach out? Like, so think about that. And in those action steps for the Soul Fire action steps, for example, there's a section that asks you that. Why do you want to reach out to BIPOC organizations or farmers? So if it's to offer services, obviously that's wonderful. One example I had that I shared yesterday is, I think the question was like, what can small white-led land trusts and farmer services organizations do? And I remembered this moving to a new town in around here that was a primarily overwhelmingly white town. And I got a knock on the door one day, and it was this person I had never met before, and she was holding a basket. And I was like, what is this about? And it was actually a welcome wagon. There's this like town welcome wagon that I've never experienced in my life. And I thought, wow, this is so quaint and so cute. And this person actually sat with me for the better part of an hour and just asked us about who we were, what we're doing, shared about herself and the town, and had a basket full of all the services that the town offers. So, you know, coffee from the cafe, and dry cleaner coupons, and you know, peanuts, and all these like wonderful little things that are all part of what the town has in their business section. And it was a really lovely way to just say, welcome to the community, and we want to know more about you, and here's more about us. And there's no attachment, there's no expectation, there's no what can you do for me or what can I do for you. It's simply just a bridge to build relationship. And that's where I would suggest to start, is to start with that relationship building. And with that, I will say thank you. I know it's 3:29 and Jamie needs to wrap up, but you'll get our email. And if you have any other questions, you can email us at connect@nefolklandtrust.org. I really appreciate the time and for everybody to see everybody's faces and for your participation and your questions. And again, to Jamie and Megan and AFT for providing this space.
Thank you so much, Steph. That was incredible, as always, and I just keep learning more and more and more from you. So I'm excited we have one more of these tomorrow. I'm sure I'll learn even more then. And there are some wonderful questions still in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I do want to take the time in the last 30 seconds here just to thank our amazing presenters. Thank you, Steph. Thanks to our video contributors, Omar, Christine, and Leah, for sharing their wisdom and experiences with us today. I do have a quick plug and request for all of you. I'm going to paste a link here in the chat to please just click that open. If you have time to do it now, please do. Otherwise, we will be sending it around in a follow-up email within the next day or so. Just a quick feedback survey about what you thought about this workshop, anything that you wanted to learn, we're hoping to learn. It's also a way we might be able to follow up with you with any further resources. So please do fill that out for us. We'd really appreciate it. And then lastly, you know, we just want to wrap up by saying thanks again for being here with us today. Thanks for being on this learning journey. For those just showing up today, as well as for those who have been to all 5 of these, it's been a real honor and a privilege to provide this education and opportunity to network and connect with you all. So please stay in touch with us. Please feel free to follow up with me or staff with any questions that you have. And with that, I'll say have a great day, and I look forward to connecting with you all in other capacities. Be well.